The marble floors of the Pemberton mansion stretched before Eleanor like a sea of cold perfection, each square foot demanding the kind of attention that left her knees aching and her back screaming by evening's end. She dipped her brush into the bucket of soapy water, the sound echoing through the grand foyer with its cathedral ceiling and crystal chandelier that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. 4 months she had been scrubbing these floors, polishing these surfaces, dusting these priceless artifacts, and still she felt like an intruder in a world so far removed from her own experience that it might as well have been another planet. The employment agency had been clear about the expectations when they sent her for the position. The master of the house values privacy above all else, Mrs. Patterson had explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had placed many servants in many grand homes. You are to perform your duties efficiently and invisibly. No conversation unless absolutely necessary, no lingering in rooms where you're not actively working, and absolutely no curiosity about the family's personal affairs. Eleanor had nodded and accepted the terms without question, because she was in no position to be particular about employment conditions. 6 months ago she had been Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, wife of a respected bank clerk, mistress of a modest but comfortable home on Elm Street. Then the consumption had taken David with such swift cruelty that she was still reeling from the shock of being suddenly completely alone in the world. The medical bills had consumed their savings, the funeral expenses had taken what little remained, and Eleanor found herself facing a choice between accepting charity or finding work that would preserve what remained of her dignity. The Pemberton mansion offered good wages, room and board, and the kind of anonymity that appealed to a woman still raw from grief and public sympathy. She could lose herself in the repetitive tasks of cleaning and organizing, moving through the vast rooms like a ghost among treasures she would never own, maintaining a house for a family she rarely saw. And that was the strangest part of her employment, how little she actually encountered the family she worked for. Mrs. Pemberton had interviewed her personally, a formidable woman in her 70s, who had examined Eleanor with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating potential problems. You'll be responsible for the main floors, the library, and the conservatory, she had explained. The upper floors are managed by other staff and you'll have no occasion to venture there. Since then, Eleanor had caught only glimpses of the Pembertons. Mr. Pemberton was apparently a widower who spent most of his time traveling on business. His elderly mother maintained a strict schedule that rarely brought her into the areas where Eleanor worked. There were adult children who visited occasionally, their voices echoing from the dining room during formal dinners that Eleanor helped prepare but never served. But there was one member of the household who remained completely mysterious, the figure Eleanor had taken to thinking of as the silent master. She knew he existed because Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned him during that first interview, referring obliquely to "my son's condition" and explaining that he preferred solitude and was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Eleanor had accepted this as one more peculiarity of wealthy families, people who could afford to indulge eccentric relatives and house them in separate wings with their own staff and schedules. She had seen evidence of his existence, meals carried upstairs on silver trays, books moved around the library as if someone had been reading and replacing them, fresh flowers that appeared and disappeared from the conservatory without explanation. More intriguingly, there were the improvements that happened overnight like fairy tale magic. Eleanor would spend a day struggling with a particularly stubborn stain on the parquet floor, only to arrive the next morning to find it mysteriously gone. A loose floorboard that had been catching her mop would be perfectly level by the following week. The ancient window in the library that had been painted shut for decades suddenly opened smoothly when she tried it on a particularly stuffy afternoon. At first, Eleanor had assumed these fixes were the work of maintenance staff who came during the night shift. But as the improvements continued, always seeming to address exactly the problems she had been encountering in her work, she began to wonder if someone was watching her efforts and quietly making her job easier. The possibility made her feel exposed and self-conscious in ways she couldn't quite articulate. There was something unsettling about the idea that her struggles with stubborn locks and uneven floors were being observed and remedied by an invisible benefactor. Yet at the same time, there was something almost protective about the attention, as if someone was ensuring that her difficult work didn't become impossible. It was during one of the autumn storms that battered the mansion's tall windows that Eleanor first saw him clearly. She was working late in the library, taking advantage of the empty house to do a thorough cleaning of the reading alcoves when the electric lights suddenly failed. The backup gas lamps hadn't been lit, and Eleanor found herself in complete darkness, with only the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate her surroundings. She was groping her way toward the door when she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the carpet behind her. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering as she realized she wasn't alone in the dark library. Before she could call out or flee, warm hands gently touched her shoulders, steadying her. "Don't be afraid," a voice said softly near her ear. "Let me help you find your way." The voice was cultured, gentle, with the slight hoarseness of someone who rarely spoke aloud. Eleanor felt herself being guided carefully through the maze of furniture, toward where she remembered seeing a lamp earlier. The hands that held her arm were firm but careful, and she caught a scent that was distinctly masculine, soap and leather, and something that might have been ink. "There's a gas lamp on the table by the window," the voice continued. "Can you feel the edge of the table?" Eleanor's fingers found the polished wood, then the brass base of the lamp. She heard the scratch of a match, and suddenly the library was filled with golden light that revealed her mysterious helper. He was perhaps 35 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too much time indoors. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes were expensive but rumpled, as if he paid little attention to his appearance. But it was his face that caught Eleanor's attention, not because it was particularly handsome, though it was pleasant enough, but because of the terrible scars that ran down the right side from temple to jaw. The scarring was old, long-healed but still prominent, the kind of disfigurement that would make people look away quickly or stare with uncomfortable fascination. Eleanor understood immediately why he preferred solitude, why meals were sent to his rooms, why Mrs. Pemberton had spoken of his condition with such careful euphemisms. For a moment, they stood frozen in the lamplight, each taking measure of the other. Eleanor expected to see embarrassment or anger in his eyes at being discovered, but what she found instead was curiosity, and something that might have been relief. "You're not supposed to see me," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of resigned humor. "I imagine this is quite a shock." Eleanor found her voice at last. "You're Mr. Pemberton's son." "I am. Matthew Pemberton, though I haven't used that name socially in a very long time." He studied her face carefully. "You're Eleanor Hartwell, the widow from Elm Street." Eleanor stared at him in surprise. "How do you know that?" Matthew smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face in ways that made Eleanor's breath catch. "I know a great deal about you, Mrs. Hartwell. I know that you lost your husband 6 months ago, and that the medical expenses left you in difficult circumstances. I know that you're working here to maintain your independence rather than accepting charity from the church. I know that you take exceptional care with your work, and that you treat our possessions as if they were your own treasures." The revelation that she had been observed so closely should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. There was nothing predatory in Matthew's manner, nothing that suggested improper interest. Instead, Eleanor sensed a loneliness that matched her own, an isolation born of different circumstances, but equally profound. "Have you been watching me work?" she asked. "I have," Matthew admitted without embarrassment. "Initially because I was curious about the new staff member who was so different from our usual employees. You move through the house as if you appreciate its beauty rather than simply maintaining it. You handle books as if you understand their value, arrange flowers as if you're creating art rather than just filling vases." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliments. "I was a teacher before I married," she said. "I suppose old habits of respecting knowledge and beauty die hard." "And you've been making small improvements," Matthew continued, "moving furniture to better catch the light, arranging the conservatory plants to show them to best advantage, organizing the library by topic rather than just size. Subtle changes, but ones that show genuine care for the space." Eleanor had been making those small adjustments, taking quiet satisfaction in improvements that she hoped would go unnoticed. To learn that they had been not only observed but appreciated was both gratifying and unsettling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I should have asked permission before changing anything." "Don't apologize," Matthew said quickly. "Your improvements have made this house feel more like a home than it has in years. I was simply curious about the person who cared enough to make them." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the storm still raging outside while the lamp created a circle of warmth in the vast library. Eleanor found herself studying Matthew's face, noting how the scars did nothing to diminish the intelligence in his eyes or the kindness in his expression. "The repairs," she said suddenly. "The loose floorboard, the sticky window, the stain that disappeared overnight. That was you." Matthew nodded. I have trouble sleeping, so I often work on projects during the night hours. When I noticed the difficulties you were encountering, it seemed natural to address them. Why? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Why go to such trouble for a servant? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Because you work as if this house matters to you, he said finally. Because you take pride in your labor, even when you think no one is watching. Because, he paused, then continued with obvious difficulty, because it's been a long time since I've seen someone bring such care and grace to their daily tasks. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and loneliness that had lived there since David's death. Here was someone who saw value in her work, who appreciated the effort she put into tasks that others considered menial. Mr. Pemberton, she began, then stopped as he held up a hand. Matthew, please. I think we've moved beyond formal address. Matthew, Eleanor corrected, I should return to my work. Your mother was very clear about the importance of maintaining schedules. My mother is asleep, Matthew said gently, and the storm has knocked out power to half the city. I think we can consider this an exceptional circumstance. He moved to one of the leather chairs by the fireplace, gesturing for Eleanor to take the seat across from him. Would you mind staying for a few minutes? It's been a long time since I've had a conversation with someone who wasn't paid to be kind to me. Eleanor heard the loneliness in his request and found herself settling into the offered chair, despite her better judgment. How long has it been since you preferred solitude? Matthew touched the scars on his face unconsciously. 7 years. There was an accident. A fire at one of our textile mills. I was inspecting the building when a lamp exploded, and by the time they pulled me out, he gestured vaguely at his disfigurement. The physical healing took months. The social healing never quite happened. Eleanor felt her heart clench with sympathy. She could imagine the stares, the whispered comments, the way people would look away or make excuses to avoid spending time with someone whose appearance made them uncomfortable. People can be unkind, she said quietly. Not unkind exactly, Matthew replied with bitter humor. Just uncomfortable. Dinner invitations stopped coming. Former friends found reasons to be busy when I called. Even my own family began making excuses about why I shouldn't attend social gatherings. He was quiet for a moment. Eventually it became easier to simply withdraw than to endure the constant reminder that I had become something people preferred not to see. Eleanor thought of her own recent experience with social isolation, the way people had avoided her after David's death, not from cruelty, but from their own discomfort with grief and loss. Death made people awkward in the same way that disfigurement did, forcing them to confront realities they preferred to ignore. I understand, she said simply. After my husband died, I found that people didn't know how to talk to me anymore. I was a reminder of something they didn't want to think about, that loss could happen to anyone, that security was more fragile than we like to believe. Matthew studied her face with obvious interest. Is that why you took this position? To avoid the discomfort of others? Eleanor considered the question seriously. Partly, but also because I needed to prove to myself that I could survive independently, that I was more than just David's widow waiting for someone to take care of me. And have you proven that to yourself? Eleanor looked around the beautiful library, thinking of the months she had spent maintaining this house, taking pride in work well done, building a new identity based on her own efforts rather than her relationship to someone else. I think I have, she said with surprise. I hadn't realized it until this moment, but yes, I think I have. Matthew smiled, and Eleanor found herself noticing how the expression softened his features, making the scars seem less prominent and the man more present. I'm glad, he said sincerely. It would be a waste for someone with your capabilities to disappear into permanent mourning. They talked for another hour as the storm gradually subsided, sharing stories about their past lives and their current circumstances. Eleanor learned that Matthew was a voracious reader, with interests ranging from philosophy to engineering, that he had been deeply involved in the family business before his accident, and that he spent his solitary hours writing technical articles that were published under a pseudonym. You're still working, Eleanor realized, just differently. I found I needed intellectual challenges to stay sane, Matthew admitted. Physical isolation is bearable if your mind remains engaged. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since David's death. Matthew was an excellent conversationalist, well-informed, and genuinely interested in her opinions on everything from current events to literary preferences. More importantly, he treated her as an equal despite their different social positions, asking her thoughts on complex topics and listening to her responses as if they mattered. When they finally parted, Matthew disappearing back into the shadows of the house, while Eleanor returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, she felt more alive than she had in months. For the first time since becoming a widow, she had been seen not as an object of pity or a problem to be managed, but as an interesting person worthy of genuine conversation. The next morning, Eleanor approached her work with renewed energy, but also with a new awareness of her surroundings. Now that she knew Matthew was watching, she found herself more conscious of her movements, more thoughtful about her small improvements to the household arrangements, not because she felt self-conscious, but because she had discovered someone who genuinely appreciated her efforts. Over the following weeks, their nighttime encounters became more frequent. Sometimes it was just a brief conversation when their paths crossed in the corridors after the rest of the household had retired. Other times, they would spend hours in the library or conservatory, talking about books, sharing thoughts on the day's news, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Eleanor learned that Matthew was far from the reclusive invalid she had initially imagined. His self-imposed isolation had been a choice born of social discomfort rather than physical limitation, and in the privacy of his own home, he was articulate, passionate, and surprisingly funny. His scars, which had seemed so prominent at their first meeting, became simply part of his appearance, no more defining than the color of his eyes or the shape of his hands. "You know," Matthew said one evening, as they sat in the conservatory surrounded by the exotic plants he had collected over the years, "I had forgotten how much I enjoyed having someone to talk to about ideas rather than just practical necessities." Eleanor, who had been examining a particularly beautiful orchid, looked up with interest. "What do you mean?" "Conversations with my family, with business associates, even with friends before the accident. They were always about concrete things. Finances, social events, practical decisions. But you ask questions about why things work the way they do, what people's motivations might be, how ideas connect to each other." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the observation. "I suppose that's the teacher in me. I've always been more interested in understanding than just knowing." "It's more than that," Matthew said seriously. "You have a genuinely curious mind. It's refreshing." Their relationship might have continued indefinitely in this pleasant pattern of friendship and intellectual companionship, but everything changed the night Eleanor discovered Matthew collapsed in the library, his breathing labored and his face grey with pain. "Matthew!" She dropped to her knees beside his chair, her cleaning supplies forgotten. "What's wrong? Should I call for the doctor?" "No," Matthew managed, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "No doctor. Just give me a moment." Eleanor could see that this was more than just a momentary weakness. Matthew's breathing was shallow and irregular, and there was a quality to his pallor that spoke of serious illness rather than simple fatigue. "This has happened before," she said, "and it wasn't a question." Matthew nodded reluctantly. "The fire damaged more than just my face. My lungs were affected as well. Most of the time it's manageable, but sometimes you can't breathe properly and you're too proud to ask for help," Eleanor finished, her voice sharp with worry and frustration. "I don't want to be an invalid," Matthew said quietly. "I don't want people treating me as if I'm fragile or pitiful." Eleanor studied his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the prospect of being seen as weak or dependent. "Matthew," she said gently, "there's a difference between being weak and being human. Everyone needs help sometimes. Everyone has limitations. The trick is learning when to accept assistance gracefully instead of suffering unnecessarily." Over the following hour, Eleanor helped Matthew through the worst of the breathing episode, using techniques she had learned during David's illness to help him relax and regulate his respiration. She made tea with honey to soothe his throat, adjusted the lighting to reduce strain, and simply stayed with him until the crisis passed. "Thank you," Matthew said finally, his voice still hoarse but stronger. I'm not accustomed to accepting help." "I can see that," Eleanor replied with gentle humor, "but you've been helping me for months, making my work easier, fixing problems I was struggling with, providing intellectual stimulation I didn't know I was missing. Perhaps it's time to let the assistance flow both directions." Matthew looked at her with an expression of wonder and something deeper. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned earlier." Eleanor felt her heart skip, uncertain whether she was about to hear good news or bad. "I know who you are," Matthew continued. Not just your name and circumstances, but who you were before your marriage. Eleanor Hayes, who taught at the Riverside Academy for Young Ladies, who wrote articles for the Educational Review under the initials E.H., who was considered one of the most innovative teachers in the region before she married David Hartwell and retired from professional life. Eleanor stared at him in shock. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been reading your work for years, Matthew said with a smile. Your articles on progressive education methods, your essays on the importance of critical thinking in curriculum development, they've influenced my own thinking about worker education and training programs. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. You knew who I was when I was hired. I knew who you had been, Matthew corrected. And I was curious about what had happened to one of the most brilliant educational minds in the region. When I learned you were working as domestic staff, I wondered if there might be a story worth understanding. And what did you conclude? Matthew's expression grew serious. I concluded that circumstances had forced a remarkable woman into a position far beneath her capabilities, and that she was making the best of it with grace and dignity. But also that she might be ready for something more challenging than floor scrubbing. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the Pemberton Foundation needs a director of educational initiatives, someone who understands progressive teaching methods, who can design worker training programs, who can help us establish schools in the communities where our businesses operate. Eleanor stared at him, hardly daring to understand what he was offering. How you're talking about a professional position, a career. I'm talking about using your real talents for work that matters, Matthew said simply. Work that would make a difference in people's lives while allowing you to maintain your independence and dignity. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes. After months of feeling invisible, of scrubbing floors and dusting furniture, while her mind atrophied from lack of stimulation, the prospect of returning to meaningful work seemed almost too good to be true. Why? She asked. Why would you offer this to me? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Because I've fallen in love with your mind, he said finally. Because watching you bring intelligence and care to even the simplest tasks has reminded me what it means to find purpose in work. Because I think you could help me build something that would outlast both of us. Eleanor felt her heart race at his words, at the possibility they represented. Matthew, I need you to understand something. I care deeply for my husband, and I'm not sure I'm ready for... I'm not asking you to replace what you had with David, Matthew interrupted gently. I'm asking if you might be interested in building something different with me, a partnership based on shared work and mutual respect, love, if it comes, but not dependent on it for its foundation. Eleanor looked at this man, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who had offered her not just rescue but opportunity, who understood that love could take many forms and that partnership could be its own kind of intimacy. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'm interested in building something with you. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded over the months that followed as they worked together to establish the Foundation's educational programs. Eleanor threw herself into the work with passionate enthusiasm, designing curricula, visiting potential school sites, interviewing teachers and administrators. Matthew provided funding, business expertise, and political connections, but more importantly, he provided intellectual partnership and unwavering support for Eleanor's vision. As they worked side by side, their relationship deepened from friendship to something more complex and precious. They discovered that they complemented each other perfectly. Eleanor's educational expertise balancing Matthew's business acumen, her optimism tempering his caution, his practical experience grounding her idealistic impulses. More than that, they discovered that intimacy could be built on shared purpose as much as shared passion, that love could grow from respect and admiration rather than just attraction, and that two people scarred by their different experiences could heal together in ways neither could achieve alone. When Matthew proposed 8 months after their first conversation in the storm-darkened library, it was during a planning meeting for their third school, surrounded by architectural drawings and budget spreadsheets rather than flowers and candlelight. Eleanor, he said, looking up from the papers scattered across his desk, I have a question that's not related to teacher salaries or building permits. Eleanor glanced up from her own work, noting the nervous quality in his voice. What is it? Will you marry me? Matthew asked simply. Not because either of us needs rescue, but because we've built something together that's stronger than either of us could create alone? Eleanor looked around the office they shared, thinking of the schools they were building, The lives they were changing, the partnership they had forged from the most unlikely circumstances. She thought of the woman who had scrubbed floors in this house 6 months ago, invisible and grieving, and the woman she had become through work and purpose and the recognition of her own worth. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying all the certainty and joy of a perfectly executed lesson plan. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was small and practical, held in the conservatory among the plants Matthew had collected and Eleanor had arranged with such care. Pastor Williams officiated, speaking eloquently about the different forms love could take and the courage required to build new kinds of families from the remnants of old sorrows. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought them together. Grief and necessity leading to friendship, friendship growing into partnership, partnership blooming into love. She had entered this house as invisible domestic staff and emerged as a professional educator, a business partner, and a woman ready to claim her full potential. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked as they danced to the small string quartet he had hired for their reception. "I'm thinking about invisibility," Eleanor replied with a smile. "How sometimes being unseen allows us to discover who we really are beneath all the roles other people expect us to play." Matthew spun her around their makeshift dance floor, and Eleanor laughed with pure delight. Around them, their small group of friends and family celebrated, foundation staff whose work they supported, teachers whose careers they had launched, students whose lives had been changed by the schools they had built together. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Matthew became known throughout the region for their innovative educational programs and their unusual partnership. They established dozens of schools, trained hundreds of teachers, and touched thousands of lives through their commitment to providing quality education regardless of economic circumstances. Their marriage became a model for other couples who had found love later in life or under difficult circumstances, proving that partnership built on shared values and mutual respect could be just as strong as romance built on passion and attraction. Eleanor never entirely forgot the month she had spent scrubbing floors and feeling invisible, but she came to see that time as essential preparation for everything that followed. The humility she had learned from service work, the attention to detail that domestic tasks had required, the resilience she had developed in isolation, all of it contributed to her effectiveness as an educator and administrator. When Eleanor died at the age of 68, her funeral filled the largest church in the city, and overflow crowds gathered outside to hear the service through open windows. Students and teachers from across the region came to honor the woman who had transformed education in their communities. Business leaders acknowledged her role in developing progressive labor policies. Social reformers praised her advocacy for women's rights and opportunities. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Matthew himself, now 73, but still actively involved in their foundation's work. He spoke of a woman who had taught him that true partnership required seeing and valuing each other's full potential, not just accepting what circumstances had revealed. Eleanor came into this house as domestic staff, he told the assembled crowd, but she was never really invisible. She was simply waiting for someone to recognize what had always been there: brilliance, compassion, and the courage to use her gifts in service of others. He paused, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "She taught me that love comes in many forms, but the strongest kind is built on shared purpose and mutual respect. She showed me that two people scarred by different experiences can create something beautiful together, something that honors their past while building toward a better future." The foundation that bore both their names continued to operate long after their deaths, establishing schools and training programs that reflected their shared belief in the transformative power of education. But their most important legacy was the model they had created for love that grew from recognition rather than rescue, partnership that honored both individuals while creating something larger than either could achieve alone. And in the conservatory of the mansion where they had first worked together, the plants that Eleanor had tended with such care continued to bloom season after season, tended now by foundation staff who understood that their founder's greatest achievement had been learning to see each other clearly and love what they discovered there.